Dr. Marianne Clark prided herself on her clinical detachment, her ability to navigate the labyrinth of the human mind without ever losing her own bearings. Over the years, she had gained a reputation as a psychiatrist, capable of unearthing even the most deeply buried trauma. But when Thomas Grayson became her patient, she began to doubt everything she knew, including her own sanity. Thomas had been committed following a series of violent incidents he couldn't recall. The notes in his file painted a fragmented picture of a man plagued by dissociative identity disorder. But there was something unusual about his case, something the other doctors couldn't quite articulate. "It's like he's not just fractured," one had told her. "It's as if he's housing something else." Marianne dismissed the comment as the byproduct of an overworked mind. But that was before she met him. From the moment Thomas walked into her office, Marianne felt an uneasy tension settle in the air. He was a man of average build, with dark circles under his eyes and a posture that screamed defeat. Yet his presence was oppressive, as though he carried with him an invisible weight that pressed down on everyone around him. "Thank you for seeing me," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course, Thomas," Marianne said, offering her most professional smile. "Why don't you tell me what's been happening?" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as though expecting to see something lurking there. "I'm not alone," he said finally. "I mean, in my head. I can feel them. Watching. Waiting. Them," Marianne repeated, pen poised over her notepad. Thomas nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. They're not like voices. They're more than that. They're alive. And they hate me." Marianne suppressed a shiver. "Can you describe them?" Thomas shook his head violently. No, if I talk about them, they'll hear me. They always hear me." Marianne leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. His paranoia was palpable, but there was something else, a quiet certainty that chilled her more than his words. "Let's try a different approach," she said gently. "Can you tell me about the last time you felt their presence?" Thomas's eyes flicked to hers, wide and bloodshot. "They're here now." In the weeks that followed, Marianne delved deeper into Thomas's psyche, hoping to unravel the truth of his condition. His personalities, if that's what they were, emerged with alarming clarity. There was Victor, cold and calculating, who spoke with a quiet menace that set Marianne's teeth on edge. Then there was Jonah, timid and childlike, who cried inconsolably during their sessions. And finally, there was something other, a presence that didn't name itself, didn't speak, but made its existence known in subtle, unsettling ways. "Victor says he wants to hurt people," Jonah whispered one day, his small voice trembling. "He says it's the only way to make them go away." Marianne's pen paused mid-sentence. "Who is them?" she asked. Jonah's eyes darted toward the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. "You don't want to know," he whispered. "Jonah, if there's something—" "No!" he screamed, his voice shrill and panicked. "Don't say it! Don't make them come out!" The lights in the room flickered, and a sudden chill enveloped Marianne. Jonah's outburst subsided as quickly as it had begun, and when she looked at him again, he was staring at her with an eerie calm. "You shouldn't have asked," he said. But it wasn't Jonah's voice. Marianne became consumed by Thomas's case. She spent countless hours reviewing session tapes, searching for patterns or clues, but instead of answers, she found more questions. In one recording, Thomas's reflection in the mirror moved independently of him. In another, his voice distorted, deepening into a guttural growl that sent shivers down her spine. Her colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor. "You need to take a step back," one of them warned. "You're getting too close." But Marianne couldn't stop. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a vast abyss, and the only way to understand it was to dive in. One night, as she watched a particularly disturbing tape, the power in her office flickered. The screen filled with static, and through the distortion, she saw something. A dark figure standing just behind Thomas. Her breath caught in her throat. She rewound the tape, but the figure was gone. The lights flickered again, and Marianne's office was plunged into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking, but before she could turn on the flashlight, she heard it. A whisper, low and insidious. "He's ours now." Marianne spun around, her heart pounding. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered, seeping into her bones. The next day, Marianne confronted Thomas about the tape. When she described the figure she had seen, his reaction was immediate and visceral. He recoiled, his face pale and his breathing labored. "You saw them?" he whispered. "They're not supposed to let you see them." "Who are they?" Marianne pressed, her voice tight with fear. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "They're not me," he said, "but they're inside me. They've always been inside me." Before Marianne could respond, Thomas's body went rigid. His head tilted back, and a guttural voice emerged from his throat. "You shouldn't have looked," it said. "Now you're part of us." Marianne stumbled back, her heart racing. "Thomas!" she called, her voice shaking. "Can you hear me?" The figure that turned to face her wasn't Thomas. His eyes were black, his smile cruel and inhuman. "Thomas is gone," the voice said, "and soon you will be too." Marianne barely remembered fleeing the session. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She locked herself in her office, her hands trembling as she dialed the hospital director's number. But before she could press call, her phone screen went black. A single word appeared. "Victor." The whispers began again, louder this time, filling the room with their cacophony. Marianne covered her ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head now, worming their way into her thoughts. "You can't save him," they said. "You can't even save yourself." Marianne left her practice soon after. She retreated to a remote cabin, far from the city, far from people. She destroyed her phone, cut off all contact, and spent her days scribbling in a journal, documenting every whisper, every shadow, every fleeting glimpse of the figures that haunted her. She knew they would come for her eventually, but until then she would wait, and she would watch. Because she knew one thing for certain: they were always watching her too.